네, 이어서 두 번째 기조연설을 시작하겠습니다. 네, 두 번째 기조연설은 일과 삶의 균형, 비전이라는 주제로 이야기를 나눠볼 텐데요. 폴리 토인비 가디언 컬럼니스트께서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 네, 폴리 토인비 컬럼니스트는 노동자들의 삶을 직접 경험하며 빈곤의 문제가 단지 개인의 불성실이나 무능함으로 돌릴 수 없는 구조적인 문제에 기인하고 있음을 다양한 사례로 제시한 거세된 희망이라는 책을 저술해 사회 경종을 울린 바가 있습니다. 여러분 폴리 토인비 컬럼니스트께 뜨거운 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Very good to be here, and what a fascinating presentation we've just heard about what may be a very alarming future. Too often we talk about work in an abstract way. We look at the statistics on pay and hours and working conditions. We look ahead at the changes that we see fast approaching, this fourth industrial revolution, where robotics may turn the world of work upside down for better for many people, but the danger is perhaps for worse for many others. In theory, these new technologies can offer opportunities for better ways of working, for flexibility, for fitting the hours of work around the needs of individuals and their families. But I suspect that's, at the moment, rather deceptively optimistic, when too often that flexibility is a one-way street, with all the power in the hands of the employer to choose when and how long each employee works. Now, I've spent much of my long journalistic career investigating and writing about working conditions. I've always wanted to get as close as possible to the real experiences of people working in low-skilled jobs, vulnerable to the power of their employers. I've wanted to feel what their working life is like, and my aim has been to inform readers who've never done manual work before, to tell them what happens in worlds they never see, beyond perhaps the passing sight of a cleaner or a security guard. In my lifetime, the lives of the well-off and well-educated have grown further apart from the lives of ordinary manual workers. The already wide gap between the two halves of society has stretched further. In my writing, I've hoped to reach out to the class of people who read books and who read serious newspapers to tell them what happens out of sight, beneath their feet, in worlds they never see. What shocks me is to find that in Britain, working conditions and working rights have deteriorated in my lifetime. I was educated to believe in the inevitable march of progress. We were taught British social history as a series of forward steps. Last 150 years have seen gradual improvement from the days when miners and early factory workers worked 15 hours a day, young children worked in dangerous weaving mills, young boys were sent up chimneys. Over the years, social reformers succeeded in passing factory acts that brought safety laws and health regulation into unregulated workplaces. The political battles were very difficult, fought against a brutal form of capitalism that believed the state had no right to intervene in an employer's right to hire workers on any conditions he chose. Early trade unionists were heroes who took great risks in trying to organize workers to protect them from dangerous work and to improve their pay and conditions. Combination laws outlawed any activity where workers gathered together to combine to defend themselves. But British school children were taught the history of the rise of trade unionism as something to be proud of, as part of the development of democracy and human rights. It made future progress seem inevitable, the way we were taught it as the natural way that history always goes. But we were wrong. Progress is never inevitable. It always has to be protected against conservative forces that will always try to push back against it. The story of the progressive trend and then its sudden sharp reversal in Britain is something that I have chronicled over the years in several books. Let's start. It's one of them. Let's start in the early 1970s, when I set off to write my first book. Not this one, but it was a book called A Working Life. And I was a young journalist, just setting out from Oxford University, and I came from a family of academics and writers. What did I know of the other unseen world of unskilled work? I felt, as a reporter, I needed to experience more of the world than my own narrow background. So I set off around the country and took a variety of unskilled jobs. I worked in a factory manufacturing car parts, in a Lions cake factory, a Unilever soap factory, in a hospital, in the Women's Army, all low-paid, unskilled work. And I also spent time in observing work in a steelworks and down a coal mine. Most of these workplaces in those days had very strong trade unions, and the result was that wages held up well. In the mid-1970s was the time that was the most equal in British history, when the incomes at the top and the bottom of society were closest together. And of course, in many ways, there were still many great inequalities, but the movement was all, up until then, in a progressive direction. At the same time, social conditions were gradually improving. There were even conservative governments in the decades after the Second World War that felt a moral obligation to build, for instance, large numbers of good social housing and to keep the National Health Service and education improving. When I wrote that first book, often describing the hardships of monotonous factory work, I wasn't to know that these really would be the best of times when we were most equal in British history, when working rights were respected because of the strength of trade unions. When global inflation took off, especially after the 1973 oil crisis, the unions had to struggle hard to ensure pay kept up with galloping prices, and there were indeed many strikes to stop pay falling too far behind soaring inflation. But in 1979, everything changed. Margaret Thatcher came to power with a new form of conservatism, and she brought with her the neoliberal ideas of Friedrich von Hayek. She kept a battered copy of his most famous work, The Road to Serfdom, in her handbag, and she would shake it at members of her cabinet. She put into reverse the trend towards greater equality, and within a few years, in the 1980s, incomes at the top took off stratospherically, while the incomes of those at the bottom fell behind and the gap grew wider. With her big bang deregulation of the city, the world of high finance and banking saw the explosion of private equity and a surge in the wealth of those who worked in that sector. She cut top tax rates and capital gains tax, which further increased top incomes. At the same time, she introduced new laws which cut back on trade union rights, weakening the strength of unionism, politically and in the workplace. She privatized many of the state industries. The loss of a balance of power, with only a weak team tugging on the workers' end of the rope, caused a major economic shift. The proportion of the economy, as we heard from our American friend, going to wages shrunk, while the proportion going to share dividends at capital increased. So after my first book, I set out again, not this one, but another book, to take low-paid jobs, to see what had happened to them since, what had changed, how different was the world of work now. First, there were the structural changes to the economy. First, there were the structural changes to the economy. Manufacturing and heavy industry have all declined sharply in the last decades. Almost all the factories where I worked in 1971 had closed down, though they had been familiar British brand names, but all now gone. Coal mine and the steel works I had written about also closed in the Great Thatcher shutdown. One of the few places I could return to was the National Health Hospital, where I had worked for both my books 30 years apart. And that was the only workplace I found that still had trade unions. One purpose of the second book was to find out how easy it is to live on the British minimum wage. How far does the minimum wage stretch? And to make sure that this was an accurate experiment, I rented out a flat in a large, rather bleak council housing estate in Lambeth, South London, near where I lived, and yet a world away from my usual comfortable life. How much money would I have to live on after paying the rent, the energy bills? How could I afford things that I usually took for granted? I went to the local job centre to take whatever minimum wage jobs were on offer. One by one, I took jobs as a care worker. As a care worker in an old people's home, I worked in a call centre. I worked in a cake packing company tucked away in a dingy Lambeth back street. And I was for a while a dinner lady, working and serving children's lunches in a primary school. And I worked as a nursery assistant in a day nursery looking after babies. What had changed in this time? I was mainly now working in service, not manufacturing jobs. Significantly, I was now not usually working directly for the company, but for an employment agency as a temporary worker. And this was a relatively new phenomenon at that point, and a very unwelcome one for the growing numbers of temporary workers. Those I worked with wanted to become permanently and securely employed. As temporary workers, they had very few of the same legal rights guaranteed by the European Union: no right to paid time off for holidays, to sick pay, or to maternity or paternity leave at the birth of a child, and they had very little, much less protection from instant dismissal. Time and again, good workers who'd worked for a long time in one company begged the company to take them on as full-time permanent staff. Often they were promised it would happen, but it really did. What did I find out? I was reminded something people often forget, is how strong the work ethic is, that it's a basic human instinct to work hard and do your best. These people, though they were badly treated, were diligent, despite receiving very little respect or dignity. Yet so many employers, and certainly our social security system, treats people as if they would be idle and work shy unless they were constantly bullied and chivied to work harder. And take one example. The hardest job I did in many ways was to be a care assistant in a care home for the elderly. Each of us had 6 old people to look after during our 8 or 12-hour shift. All of the old people were incontinent and bedridden. Everything had to be done for them: bathing, dressing, feeding, and there was never enough time. Often some people weren't got out of bed until lunchtime. Often the bells would ring, people would need help, and you just couldn't do it because you had too many people to look after. Very often somebody would be away or ill, or there were too many staff vacancies, and you would look after maybe 8 people in the course of a day, and it just wasn't possible. And the people I worked with really did care for the people, and they really minded that they couldn't care well enough or talk to them or look after them in the way they would like their own parents to be looked after. Some of the jobs I did were just deadly boring, with no human consideration for the workforce. I think the worst was probably working in a call centre, heavily supervised every minute of the day, making call after call, and mostly receiving fairly abusive replies from people on the other end, turning human beings into those kinds of robots. What I found in the world of low-paid work is the overwhelming lack of basic human respect from employers. You are treated with contempt, as if your time is worth nothing. So an employment agency will send you to the other end of town, leave you waiting for a long time, make you fill out long forms, send you back to the other end of town, as if your time really didn't matter. Whereas if you're living on the minimum wage, every hour of your time that you're not earning, you are a little closer to hunger. I calculated every last penny of the money that I had and found that, yes, you could survive, but only at the most basic level, living on rice and lentils and occasionally maybe an orange as a treat. I found that you never traveled by the underground, London Underground. It was too expensive. You traveled by buses, but even then you would often walk to save the bus fare. I found I couldn't afford light bulbs for all of the lights in my flat. I couldn't afford painkillers when I had a headache. My children were grown up, but if I'd had my children with me, how much harder that would have been. Most of the children of the people I worked with never had birthday parties for their children because they couldn't afford to invite other children round. I was looking in the second book at what had happened to pay in the 30 years between my two books. And by finding a job with the same grade in the same hospital, I was able to make that comparison. And in order to compare my pay rate in real terms, allowing for inflation over 3 decades, I took my two pay slips to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is our most respected institute studying pay. They calculated that I was now paid 20% less in real terms than I had received 30 years earlier. That came as a shock. I think I'd expected pay to rise a little, but I hadn't expected it to actually fall back to that degree. And that represents exactly what has happened in Britain during that time, where chief executives of FTSE 100 companies are now paid 130 times the average pay of their employees. There is a huge change that has affected all of society and its attitudes since the 1970s. There was another important change too. When I worked in that hospital in the 1970s, I was directly employed by the state. I was a member of staff belonging to the National Health Service, but when I returned 30 years later, I was no longer a member of staff. I was an outsourced temporary worker working for an employment agency, which in turn was sending me to be employed by an outsourced company, Carillion. All of the lower-ranking jobs in the hospital are now being outsourced to the company: the cleaning, the portering, the security, the low-paid care assistants. We used to feel a proud part of being the National Health Service, but now we were working at 2 removes for a temp agency and being paid a lot less. Where was that sense of belonging and loyalty to come from? It felt quite different to me when nobody in the hospital management knew the names or felt any responsibility for the lower staff who were not their employees. Now that's exactly what's happening all the way through the British workforce, and indeed increasingly globally. Fewer and fewer people belong to a team in their workplace. They're atomized, individualized, sole traders. In Britain, self-employment is rising, and it's gone up by 70% since 2010. In the UK now, 15% of people are self-employed, and the number is still rising very fast. It's the same as the EU average, but averages disguise big differences. Wealthier EU countries treat their workers better. Poorer countries have much higher rates of self-employment, so it's 31% in Greece. There will be a growing number of such workers as new companies spring up, relying on self-employment, low pay, 0 hours contracts, where the worker must be permanently available but not guaranteed sufficient hours to ensure they can survive on their pay. Countries such as Uber Taxis, Deliveroo, Hermes, other delivery companies. Of course, some people are very glad to be self-employed, those new entrepreneurs with their own startup businesses. Flexible hours and the ability to choose when to work suits many people. But that choice needs to be with the worker, not with the whim of the employer. Often workers are unwillingly treated as self-employed, so the employers can avoid working rights and, above all, avoid paying full taxes. And this form of tax avoidance by employers is now costing the UK Treasury, the government, £3.5 billion. And there are beginning to be cases challenging its legality. Insecure work is increasing, with more 0 hours agency working. Since the crash of 2008, Britain has prided itself on a much higher rate of employment than most of Europe, but that has come at a very high price to working conditions. 1 in 10 British workers is now in a precarious job without rights. Most of the new jobs have been low paid, and many of them precarious. The self-employed are isolated, hard to organize. Employers often forbid union recruiters from entering the workplace to enlist people to join, and so many of the most vulnerable in the fast food, care, catering sectors, changing jobs frequently, are very difficult for unions to recruit. As a result, trade union membership is falling, only 26% of women, 21% of men, and most of those are in the public sector. And conditions are hardest for women. The gap between women and men's pay was reducing, but it's now widening again at 14%. Women's work is just not valued as much as men's. If we're looking for work-life balance, the first and most important requirement is for people to earn a living wage so that they can earn enough to keep their families without having to work very long hours, often taking 2 or even 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. Beyond that, for a good work-life balance, everyone needs the state to provide public services to support them through every stage of the life cycle. That means good, affordable childcare, and it means good, kind care for the elderly. To see the history of social progress going backwards and into reverse would shock all of those previous generations who fought so hard, law by law, to ensure workers against exploitation. How shocked they would be to see inequality rising again. And in our book, Unjust Rewards, which I co-authored with David Walker, we looked at the effect of a fragmenting society where the hyper-rich draw right away from the ordinary median earners, and where a growing cohort of the low-paid fall ever further behind the rest. As part of our research for that book, we did 2 focus groups of the very rich, those people earning between £500,000 or 10 to £10 million. They were bankers and finance lawyers in the city. And we asked them to fill out a questionnaire. We wanted to know what they think about their own place in society and what do they know of the society that they nominally inhabit. We asked them to fill out a questionnaire about what they thought other people earned. Did they know what the median pay rate was or where the poverty threshold falls? And these are people, after all, who are running the nation's money, and yet they knew remarkably little. Although they were in well above the top, less than the top 1% of earners, yet they imagined themselves to be much nearer the middle. They also thought a majority of people were high earners in the upper tax bracket, when in reality it was only 15%. They found it almost impossible to believe that they inhabited a world of a very small group of the very highly privileged, where their children went to private schools. That's only 7% in Britain. They used the private health service, also only 7%. They were unaware of the society in which they had such a powerful and influential part to play. Poverty, they guessed the poverty line was twice as high as it actually is. Britain uses the same as the international rate, anyone living below 60% of the median rate. We asked them if they could justify themselves. They said maybe they had special skills, they'd made the right choices. They said things like, well, anyone who chooses to be a nurse knows they'll be paid less, so that's their choice, that's their vocation, as if presumably it was their own vocation just to be rich. When they thought about the poor, they reached for the usual lazy old stereotypes, that they were feckless or lazy or possibly drug addicts. The reality in Britain is that the great majority of people who are poor are in work, often in 2 jobs, but they are poor despite being in work. And although the last Labour government brought in tax credits to subsidise very low pay, which has helped a lot of people, over 1 million people, children, out of the poverty trap, even so, what they're also doing at the same time is to subsidise employers to underpay their workforce. Next week, we will have the 8th austerity budget in Britain, 8 years of extreme cuts in public services, 1 million public sector workers' jobs lost, and the pay of public sector workers held down for 8 years. deep cuts in benefits and tax credits for the low paid. By 2020, says the Institute of Fiscal Studies, 37% of British children will be living in poverty, though their parents will be still in work. This conference is discussing the new social contract, and that will need to bring society closer back together again with more equal incomes, with a minimum wage that will need to rise and tax credits to be increased, and trade unionism will need to be made stronger. Work-life balance begins with adequate pay, but then it requires freedoms and flexibilities in working conditions and hours. Better pay breeds better respect and esteem as the workforce is more highly valued. Stronger trade unions are one answer. Another is to drop the German system, where employees are elected onto the board of every company, leading to greater equality of rewards. So indeed, it is time for a new social contract, one where we appreciate and value one another more highly. Instead, in Britain, in my lifetime, we are seeing the treatment of the workforce go into reverse. Thank you very much.
네, 좋은 강연해주신 폴리 토인비 컬럼니스트께 다시 한번 감사 인사드리겠습니다. Thank you for your inspiring presentation, sharing your personal experiences, pointing out the crucial current issues of work life, pursuing the vision of work-life balance. Thank you once again.